The case of Ivan Milat, the most infamous serial killer in Australian history, remains one of the most shocking criminal cases the country has ever witnessed. Between 1989 and 1992, Milat abducted and murdered at least 7 backpackers, most of whom were foreigners, in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. The case not only horrified the nation due to its brutality, but also because of the long, complex investigation and many unanswered questions. In the late 1980s, Australia was enjoying a period of peace following an economic downturn. Backpacking had become a popular trend among young people, not just Australians but also international travelers. They traveled by bus, train, and especially by hitchhiking, a cheap, friendly, and adventurous method. The Hume Highway, which connects the 2 major cities of Sydney and Melbourne, became a central artery for this form of travel. But few realized it was also the perfect hunting ground for a serial killer hiding behind a seemingly ordinary face, Ivan Milat. The first missing persons report, James Gibson and Deborah Everest. Date of disappearance, December 30th, 1989. Departure point, Frankston, Victoria. Destination, Albury, NSW, about 600 kilometers away. Description, 2 close friends, both 19, carrying backpacks and dressed for summer. James Gibson and Deborah Everest, both from suburban Melbourne, decided to embark on a youthful adventure. They told their families they planned to hitchhike north to attend a music festival and camp for a few days. When no one heard from them after the first day, concern grew. However, in those days, a few days of no contact during backpacking wasn't considered unusual. What made the disappearance strange was that 2 weeks later, James's backpack and camera were found hundreds of kilometers north in Galston Gorge near Sydney. No one could explain why his belongings were there, while the 2 travelers had vanished without a trace. Simone Schmidl, the German girl with an Australian dream. Date of disappearance, January 1991. Nationality, German. Age, 20. Intended route, Melbourne to Sydney. Simone had come to Australia on a long vacation to experience the free-spirited lifestyle. Being careful and responsible, she regularly wrote letters and sent postcards to her parents in Regensburg. The last letter detailed her plan to hitchhike to Sydney. But Simone never arrived. She vanished during the Australian summer. Her family contacted the police and embassies, but there were no leads, no witnesses, and no clues. Police took note of the case, but, like with James and Deborah, did not immediately suspect foul play. The German couple, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied. Date of disappearance, late 1991. Ages, 21 and 20. Nationality, German. Background, a couple traveling around Australia before returning to Europe. Anja, a medical student, and Gabor, a former soldier, had chosen Australia as their final travel destination before settling down back home. After arriving in Sydney by bus, they planned to hitchhike to Melbourne, a route similar to Simone's. When their families didn't hear from them over Christmas, something entirely out of character, they contacted the police. But again, there were no bodies, no suspects, and no evidence. Their disappearance became another unsolved mystery and a strange blind spot in the investigation. The British friends, Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. Date of disappearance, April 1992. Nationality, British. Ages, 22 and 21. Last seen, King's Cross, Sydney, a vibrant district known among backpackers. Caroline and Joanne met in Australia and worked short-term jobs to fund their travels. They told friends they were planning to hitchhike around New South Wales. 3 weeks later, when no one had heard from them, their roommate contacted the police. Yet again, there were no signs of harm. They had simply gone missing. A pattern begins to form, but no one connects the dots yet. Individually, each disappearance seemed understandable at the time. Travelers changing plans, losing contact, misplacing belongings. But seen together, the similarities were striking. All victims were young, healthy, and traveling solo or in pairs. They were hitchhiking, vulnerable, and untraceable. They vanished along the Sydney-Melbourne route. Families described them as responsible and trustworthy. However, in 1992, police departments across states still worked in isolation. There was no national database for missing persons and no system to prioritize temporary disappearances. Thus, the serial killer quietly continued to hunt in the heart of peaceful Australia. September 19, 1992, a grisly discovery. On an ordinary Saturday, Stephen Urquhart and Bruce Pryor went camping in Belanglo State Forest, a dense, expansive area about 140 kilometers south of Sydney, known to locals for hunting and weekend barbecues. While venturing deep into the woods, Bruce noticed something odd among the dead leaves, a rounded object sticking out of the ground, covered in twigs. He brushed the dirt away and recoiled in horror. It was part of a human skull. They rushed back to their vehicle and called the police. The remains were soon identified as Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. Joanne had been stabbed 14 times, mostly in the back and chest, indicating an attack from behind or while fleeing. One stab punctured her lung, and 2 severed her spine, possibly paralyzing her before death. Caroline had been shot 10 times in the head with a semi-automatic Ruger rifle at close range. Evidence suggested she was blindfolded and executed. The shell casings were scattered in an arc, indicating the killer circled her while firing, calm and deliberate. October 5, 1993, more bodies found. Almost a year later, a man gathering firewood found another shallow grave, James Gibson. Nearby lay Deborah Everest. Unlike the British victims, they were killed with knives. James had 8 stab wounds, 1 pierced his heart. Deborah suffered multiple skull lacerations, likely inflicted post-mortem. Strangely, James's backpack and camera had been found 100 kilometers north years earlier. Was it a decoy? A psychological breadcrumb left by the killer? November 1st, 1993, the final 3. 3 more bodies were found in a separate part of the forest. They were Simone Schmidl, Gabor Neugebauer, and Anja Habschied. Simone had multiple stab wounds, some through her back, like Joanne. But Gabor and Anja suffered the worst. Gabor had been shot 6 times in the head and chest. Anja had been decapitated. Her head was never found. Beheading, especially of a woman, indicated deep-seated rage or severe psychological disturbance. The killer hadn't just murdered, he had attempted to erase identity and humanity. Task Force Air, the hunt begins. A special task force of over 30 top detectives was formed, led by Inspector Clive Small. The mission: find the monster responsible for brutally murdering 7 young people. They used criminal profiling, a new approach in Australia at the time, to build a suspect profile. A local within 100 kilometers of Belanglo, familiar with the terrain, owned a Ruger 10/22 rifle, the murder weapon. Likely had a 4WD or pickup truck, suitable for transporting victims in remote areas. Displayed signs of sexual deviance and extreme control, seen in the tying, blindfolding, and decapitation. Possibly a hunter, military conscript, or mechanic, skilled with weapons and knives. Using this profile, investigators identified over 230 potential suspects based on gun ownership, criminal history, hunting licenses, and vehicle registrations. But they needed a breakthrough. A survivor speaks. Paul Onions' lucky escape. In early 1994, British man Paul Onions called the task force. He said a man had tried to abduct him while hitchhiking near Belanglo in 1990, and he'd barely escaped. Paul recalled being picked up by a man named Bill, around 40, Australian accent, driving a 4WD. Bill acted polite but strange, mentioning camping and touching Paul's belongings. When Paul asked to stop, Bill pulled a gun and rope. Paul jumped out and fled, and was rescued by a passing couple. He had reported it to local police, but the case was not pursued. Now Paul described Bill, and police matched him to Ivan Milat, already on their suspect list. Milat owned a Ruger rifle, lived near Belanglo, drove a 4WD, and worked in road construction. Most chillingly, he had a violent past, including a prior kidnapping case against a girlfriend, but was acquitted. May 22, 1994, the arrest. Over 50 armed officers raided Milat's home in Eagle Vale, southwest Sydney. He was arrested immediately. A search of the house revealed a Ruger 10/22 rifle, matching the murder weapon. Ammunition identical to shell casings found at the crime scenes. Victims' backpacks, sleeping bags, tents, and personal items. Cameras, jackets, and shoes with traces of victim DNA. Restraints, duct tape, and maps of Belanglo. Each item was a silent scream from the victims, evidence of Milat's horrifying spree. The man behind the mask. Born in 1944, Ivan Milat was the 5th of 14 children in a Croatian-Australian family. Raised in Sydney's suburbs, he dropped out of school and worked manual labor jobs. Behind a calm exterior, he had a violent, controlling nature. Abusive to girlfriends and aggressive with friends, yet always managed to avoid jail due to lack of evidence. Neighbors described him as quiet, reserved, a lover of guns and camping. No one suspected the quiet man next door was a calculating killer who had evaded capture for years. 1996, justice served. In 1996, Ivan Milat was convicted of 7 counts of murder. He received 7 life sentences without parole. He never confessed, never explained his crimes, and never showed remorse. In prison, he remained silent, as if the murders were a game he had already won. Milat died of cancer in 2019, taking with him the secrets of other possible victims. Authorities believe the true number may exceed 7. Today, signs at Belanglo Forest read, "Do not go alone, do not go at night." Locals still claim to hear footsteps and wind that sounds like crying at night. And they still whisper the name Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer, as a warning. Because in the deep forests of Australia, there are paths you should walk only once. Otherwise, you may never return.